think MedTech needs to continue to realize that. MedTech is not just physical devices. It has biologic technology. It has AI attached to it. AI is not just going to be the best physician. It will actually be better. Target knows whether or not you're pregnant without the result of your pregnancy test based on what you're buying in your shopping cart. People know whether or not you have lung cancer based on whether or not you're buying a lot of certain kinds of tissues and wipes and cough drops and so forth. If you just take a radiologist and say, please look at this chest x-ray, and you just assume the radiologist is a human, never makes a mistake, didn't get tired, the AI can be better because it can physically see things in the pixels that the human eye cannot see. Now, it's no longer teaching the AI to be as good as the best radiologist. It's actually, the AI is better than the world's best radiologist. The best innovation is at the intersection of historical silos. So you take mechanical innovation and combine that with AI, that's really the future of healthcare.
Can't replace part of the brain.
I treat them the same.
Source of truth for the MedTech industry.
Coexists with the puppets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the MedTech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the $90 billion company. They had help up high, a lot of things.
The State of MedTech with your host, Omar M. Khatib.
Next time. Perfect. By the way, I forget, is this your first podcast?
It's not my first interview. It might be my first podcast. I'll have to admit that could be the case.
Hey, I mean, what better place to have your first podcast than the number one show in the world in MedTech? So we love that.
There you go.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Really excited for today's guest. So as you know, we've had a lot of investors on the show, a lot of people from the venture capital world. And there's this concept that there's investors that people want to hear from, but I always wanted to know, like, from the investor standpoint, like, who do the investors want to hear from? And so I've asked so many different ones, and one name that kept coming up is Garheng Kong out of HealthQuest. They're like, oh, you got to get this guy. And I can't remember, maybe it was Sean Chen or from Ascension or someone else, one of the other VCs who was just like, oh, like, if you can get Garheng, like that's an episode that I'm going to immediately listen to. So that being said, Garheng and I, we met, we hit it off. We had to make sure that we planned the episode ahead of time. And so Garheng, thanks so much for spending some time and coming on the show.
Thanks, Omar. It's great to be here and look forward to the conversation and, talking about healthcare and investing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're calling in from the great state of Texas, my home state. So it's great to have another Texan on the show.
Yep. It's Austin, Texas is home. So good to be on the show.
Wonderful. Well, Garheng, let's start out with the first thing, which is before we talk about like healthcare and investing and everything, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, who is Garheng Kong? Like, where'd you grow up? How did you get into the great world of MedTech, and how did you become an investor?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. So turns out everybody in my family is a physician. I'm actually the only non-practicing, not real doctor in my family. So really come from a family of physicians and scientists. I actually grew up in Fresno, California, which for those who are not familiar is raising capital of the world and very agriculturally inclined. But my parents are immigrants from Hong Kong. And so, we grew up in some sense with that background and mentality. But, we had I would say, nice upbringing. I have a younger sister who turns out is also a physician, as well as I mentioned, everybody. My wife's also a physician, as are my parents and so forth. But I grew up always being interested in science and medicine and engineering. And I was on the younger side when I was going through school. And so I finished a few years early. And ultimately went to Stanford to study and, to be fair, to play volleyball as well. So I had a good time both playing volleyball, but also studying, and was a chemical engineer and biology major there. But as I mentioned, med school is definitely in my future. And then you can flip hamburgers or pump gas or do whatever you want after you get your MD. It's sort of a rite of passage in our family. So after that, I went to Duke and was a professional student. And so did 4 more degrees there. I did a master's and a PhD in biomedical engineering, an MD and an MBA. And so 6 degrees later, I thought, I should probably get a job. And I did spend some time at what was then called Glaxo Wellcome, now GlaxoSmithKline. I was at McKinsey. And then I was the founder and CEO of 2 healthcare businesses, got lucky twice, had good outcomes, and then ultimately got into investing. But, if you ask, what's the common theme and driver across all that, it's really about understanding, patient impact at scale. So, if you're a physician, it's one of the best professions, I think you have a very intimate relationship with quote unquote your customer. You know more about them than a lot of times their family members do, and they share a lot of secrets with you. So it's a pretty amazing relationship. But the thing about being a physician is that you see patients one at a time. And so if you look at my father, for example, who practiced for 40 plus years, I don't know, maybe he saw 50,000 patients in his life. Of course, he knows their names, the family members' names, very intimate relationship. For me, I wanted to ask the question, could I reach more people? And so after becoming a physician, I thought, maybe if I invent something, a new device, a new diagnostic, a new therapeutic, you have the opportunity to reach more people. And it turns out I actually worked on something that worked during my PhD. And then I went through the patenting process, the licensing process. And then I learned, nothing goes from the bench to the bedside unless it gets commercialized. So that's how I ended up going to business school. And then I, did one company, and I did a second company. And then I thought, well, I should do 50 companies. But the only way to do that is if you're an investor. And so, every step of the way, you're one more step removed directly from the patient. At the end, you don't know the patient's name probably, but the scale of impact can be quite large. And, in fact, at HealthQuest, we're really privileged to say that, and it's not really we, it's really the companies that we partner with. But last year in 2024, treated, 95 million individual patients. And so, of course, I don't know their names, but the scale, is pretty significant. And so that's really how I ultimately ended up on the investing side. I'll admit to you, when I went to medical school, I had never heard of investing. So it's been a good journey, though.
I love that you share that, and I can find a lot of things that in common. So I was also formerly in medical school in Texas Tech. And I remember when I was, at some point a little disenchanted and decided it wasn't for me, one of my professors told me that medicine is a very noble calling, but if you really want to impact patients at scale, it's not being a physician. You should go into industry. And that was kind of the beginning of my journey into the space. So I love that you share that. And by the way, there's something's going on with Duke, because there's Dan Burnett, who started Theranova. There's a lot of ex-Duke physicians, Robert Isaacs, Duke has...
Dan and I were classmates.
You gotta be, are you serious?
Yeah, Dan Burnett and I were medical school classmates.
Oh my God. So. That's what a small world. Yeah, I love Dan. Dan, that was my first real exposure to a true Silicon Valley incubator. What he's done over at Theranova is very, very special. That's a great place. But yeah, that's so funny. What a small world. So in starting HealthQuest Capital, so you started it back, I believe, around 2011, 2012. I'm wondering what was kind of the unmet need that you saw in healthcare investing, and how did your vision of improving, essentially doing healthcare at scale, evolve since then? Especially now, given in the last few years where we've entered this new wave of technology of AI, right? So I'm wondering how that all started and how it's evolved. If you're a CEO of a MedTech company and you just got ghosted by another investor this week, or maybe a strategic that you're trying to have a meeting with just kind of brushed you off at a conference, and you're just sick and tired of all this, you want to make these people pretty much eat their words, right? I think I have something for you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most medtech startups don't fail because of product. And trust me, I think confidently say this after interviewing so many different startups on the show, investors, strategics. A lot of them fail because the market never really formed around them. My obsession with technology adoption, and more importantly, market engineering, has sort of taken shape over the years into my business called MarketCraft, and recruiting a top tier team around me for that. And MarketCraft, we're not just about digital marketing and campaigns and everything. We focus on engineering markets. We use AI trained models, psychology, persuasion, and strategic storytelling to manufacture something that every single CEO needs, and that's leverage. We want to give you leverage with the market, so by creating magnetic messaging and attention, we can shape a belief system that is going to attract and magnetize those early clinical adopters to you. We want to give you leverage with investors, because when your category narrative is very clear and your demand signals are loud, and you can show this early clinical pipeline, and then at that point, capital start to chase you instead of the other way around. Now you have options. And then leverage with strategics, because look, when you show a strategic, and trust me, I've had many conversations with them on this podcast and offline, when you show them that you're starting to own momentum in a space that they care about, you don't just look like a startup to them anymore. Now you look more like a partner. And if you do it really well, potentially competition they need to take out, right? So if you're an early stage MedTech CEO and this all resonated with you, I want you to stop what you're doing, put pause on this podcast, go to growmymedtech.com. That's GROW, growmymedtech.com. I want you to book time with me. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of a market analysis for you. I'm going to come to the table with 2 to 3 really good ideas. There's not a guarantee that you guys might be a fit for us. It could be the wrong time, a lot of things like that. We turn away more companies than we take on. But I can guarantee you that you're going to walk away with 2 or 3 really good ideas for free, and it's going to be a good conversation. So go to growmymedtech.com. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. And more importantly, you can feel free to vent to me about all the problems that you're having, because at MarketCraft, we want to come and solve those for you immediately. Now, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, I would say that some of the things that we do at HealthQuest may be a little bit atypical in terms of our approach. And to be fair, back then, now this concept of growth equity is pretty common. But back then there was venture and there was buyout or private equity. This concept of growth equity was a little bit less well established. And so when we thought about companies that we wanted to partner with, our theme actually was not around the sector, right? Historically, people say, do you do devices or diagnostics or digital health or services or therapeutics? The question we asked ourselves is impact, right? Better patient outcomes, better health economics, right? Cost benefit, if you will. And so when we thought about investing, we didn't actually ask ourselves, is it a certain kind of technology or a certain subsector? What we said is, does it result in better patient outcomes and better health economics? And in fact, we're quite open-minded about the underlying modality in terms of how it was going to do that. And so, in the portfolio, there can be companies that are very high in science, right? Nobel Prize winning kind of things where you can do something that you could never do before technically. And so that's one end of the range. And of course, that could have immense patient impact and also healthcare savings. But on the other end, to be fair, we could do things that I call the paperclip of healthcare, low tech, but it got used 10 billion times last year. And if you can make that a little bit better, it can also be very impactful. I mean, if you have a technology that reminds physicians to wash their hands before they walk into a patient's room, and you can reduce infections, I mean, there's no Nobel Prize there, but it can also be very impactful.
I love that you have that approach as an investor, because I feel like too many times investors are looking for like next big, highly technological thing with a gazillion-dollar market cap. But there's so many things that are very, very low tech that just have immense impact. I think like one of the things that comes to mind for me is that in spine surgery, when you're doing pedicle screw replacement, sometimes you use a K-wire, or not a K-wire, you use a guide wire. And the guide wire, the issue would go through the bone and rupture an aorta. And this gentleman came up with what's called the K-wire, which all it is a wire with a split end. And you hammer it in, and it's the end's open and stops. It's very, very low tech, right. But like it saved, who knows, thousands of lives and made spine surgery better. So I love that you guys have that spread. So like when you said that about like something that's like we'll call it like science fiction real, like Histosonics is an example of one of the investments you guys made, where when I saw it in person, for those who don't know, Histosonics uses a technique called histotripsy, where they essentially make all these like tiny little bubbles, and you see it like in their demo in the water, where there's these little bubbles that are like vibrating very fast, and then they go and they can essentially ablate a tumor or something without cutting, which is, for me, is it literally like watching magic happen. But on the other end, and like when you talk about something that's very, very low tech, what's an example of something like that in your portfolio that had that level of scale but was like super low tech?
Yeah. So of course, Histosonics, technology that we'd never done before, completely non-invasive ablation, no temperature. On the other hand, we've been involved with a company called Magnolia Medical, and they are in the infection space. And so if you think about patients who come to the hospital and you are suspicious that they might be septic, so they might have an infection in the bloodstream. I mean, that's a very serious infection. I mean, if that is the case, you're automatically inpatient, IV antibiotics, multiple days, because that's a life-threatening situation if you're septic. However, a lot of times you get something that's called a false positive. And so if you think the patient's septic, you stick a needle in their skin, you draw the blood, and then you put the blood in a culture bottle, and then you see if it grows out. But when you really think about what's happening, you are getting a plug of skin when you stick that needle into the arm to get the blood. And so that little plug of skin, because if you think about it, the needle is a hollow tube, essentially. Inside that skin could be a hair follicle, it could be a sebaceous gland, it could have a little bit of bacteria. And then you draw that into the bottle you're going to go culture, and you get a false positive. It grows something out, and you think, oh, this patient has sepsis, but really they don't have sepsis. They just have some bacteria growing on the skin or inside this hair follicle. So Magnolia came up with a really clever innovation, which is it's a device that's inline. And when you draw the first 1.5 ml of blood, it just pushes it to the side. And then you just keep drawing, and then the rest of the blood goes into the bottle that's getting cultured. And so any contaminant that came from the surface or the first 1.5 ml of blood just gets pushed to the side. And all of a sudden, false positives went from 3 to 8% down to 0 to 0.5%.
That's a huge improvement.
Yeah, it's a huge improvement. It really matters to both patients and health economics, because you're not putting a patient in the hospital that shouldn't be there getting IV antibiotics. But when you think about it, it's a quite simple innovation where you just discard the first 1.5 ml of blood that you've drawn and push it to the side. You keep the sterile path and you keep pulling it in. And when you look at it, you think to yourself, I really should have thought of that. But it makes perfect sense. It's getting adopted in lots of hospitals. It's standard of care now in many places. And it makes a lot of sense, but probably there's not going to be a Nobel Prize attached to that.
Yeah. But millions of lives saved.
Oh yeah.
As an investor, I'm wondering, when we, one of our trusted partners is LSI, Life Science Intelligence, and their trusted group of market intel analysts. And when we were looking at the numbers this past month, every month there seems to be more and more funding going to healthcare. This past month on the M&A activity, a lot of it was in the IBD space and cardiovascular space. So like M&A is up. I think Lena Khan, who is the former head of the FTC, her wrath is over. So like M&A is going to be kicking back up. Are you starting to notice that on your end as well with your portfolio companies? And like, what do you think market sentiment is these days compared to, let's say, like a year or two ago?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the FTC issue is probably less of a focus given the new administration. So I think that is definitely the case. But from an M&A perspective, I do think that, that's continued. We actually, in our portfolio, have a couple of companies, actually more than a couple of companies that are in MedTech that are in active, processes, to be fair, inbound processes. So I will say that that's been the case. Of course, last year, last year and late sort of the prior year, you look at firms like J&J that spent $30 billion buying 2 companies, basically. And then, of course, Boston Scientific's been active. Stryker bought Inari. So we are seeing those kinds of acquisitions certainly in play. And the truth is, on the MedTech side in particular, a lot of the innovation does come from smaller companies. And, large companies have innovation engines, but a lot of times they're better off taking a smaller company's assets and then deploying it. I mean, probably the poster child recently is Referrals that got acquired by Boston Scientific, and I think did maybe $1 billion in revenue the first year it came out. And so, but Referrals would have never been able to generate $1 billion in revenue if it had launched that product by itself. So that's been a good match, for example. So I think we're seeing pretty steady M&A activity. The other part is, if you think about where utilization comes from, ultimately, especially in MedTech, a lot of it is providers, physicians, hospitals, and the health, if you will, of the healthcare system has gotten better over the last couple of years, right? If you look at hospital systems in 23, I mean, most of them lost money, like hemorrhaged money. And then 24, probably still losing money, but getting better. I'd say a lot of health systems 25 are profitable and actually making money now. We're still talking about single digit margins here, but now they're in a situation where they can, think about, adopting new technologies, being more aggressive about things. So from that perspective, I think that's been, better for everybody. Now we'll see with this whole Medicaid, big beautiful bill, how that all plays out. But I would say the M&A pace has been reasonable.
Yeah, and mentioning Farapulse, like something again, just thanks to our partners over at LSI who provided this data. Like one thing that I was like, I guess shocked by, maybe I shouldn't be so shocked. I'm not an analyst, but like, I've looked at CAGRs here and there. When I see something with like a 5-6% CAGR, I'm like, oh, that's really good. PFAs, and again, this is pulling from the Compass over at LSI. The PFA market has a CAGR of 32.2%, which is just like insane to me,
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. When was the last time you saw a CAGR that high in our space?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, it's a novel modality that, to be fair, is easy to use, can be widely adopted, and, is sort of first in class. So I'm not surprised that it happened, but you're right. It's an unusual set of facts. And, occasionally you get those opportunities in MedTech to see that happen. And certainly this is one of them. But, sometimes we were thinking about others. Edwards had a really good run with TAVR, for example. And I mean, that's hasn't continued as quickly, but that's certainly been a pretty steep ramp, when it came out sort of 2013 and the following, 5 to 10 years. So we see these kinds of opportunities, and, it's always good to see in MedTech because, a lot of the companies are good, but not in this kind of growth rate.
Yeah. And do you feel like seeing, so like we had Stryker that even though they're developing a robotic spine platform, they spun out their spine division, Medtronic spun out their diabetes division. So all these strategics are spinning out like their different divisions. Do you feel like they're doing that sort of lightening their loads so that way they can have the ability to acquire into new areas? Do you think that's what's going on? What do you take when you see all that happening? Because I don't think it's coincidental. It's not just one company.
Yeah, well, to be fair, on the public side, these companies have to deal with public investors and, frequently activist investors. And the thing about large companies that have different divisions is that, I mean, it's easy to call out and say, this division is underperforming or overperforming, or some of the parts where you say, well, if I spun this division out, it would get a different multiple. And, when you add these divisions up and their natural multiples, it should be worth more. So I think that there's probably some operational reasons for why these large strategics are spinning things out. But I think a lot of it is going to be shareholder pressure to say, hey, do you really need to have all these different business units? Some of them may be better off independent and focused. To be fair, some of them may be better off from a shareholder value because you can unlock value and ultimately get a better multiple. I mean, each individual business unit will float to its natural valuation as opposed to being captured within a larger entity. And sometimes then you float to the lowest multiple of any one of those units and the whole enterprise gets valued that way. So I think that's also an important dynamic that we're seeing in the public marketplace as well. And, the other aspect of it is you can't do everything well all the time. And I do think from a focus point of view, sometimes that also makes sense. And maybe the last thing I would say is there are actually some disadvantages to scale, the diseconomies, if you will, of scale and decision-making and so forth, and even contracting, right? Sometimes if you have a deal with a large payer, they're contracting across multiple assets, whereas a small company can get a different deal because it just has its one product that it's selling, and so it can actually ironically negotiate differently with the payer. So anyways, a bunch of factors, I think. But I think the trend that you're calling out is true, but the drivers probably, multiple reasons.
Yeah, and this is not a space that I know nearly as well as you, but just something, you talked about activist investors. So like the most, I guess, well-known one that comes to mind is like Carl Icahn. And I believe he was involved with, again, I don't know, I forgot the details, but something involved with Hologic. I think Hologic was trying to go private. Massimo, most recently, they had activist investors. Is there something going on that activist investors are becoming more interested in med device? And if so, why?
I don't know if they're becoming more interested in med device. I think they're becoming more sophisticated. And so, industries that historically were maybe easier for generalists to go after, maybe it's manufacturing or things that you can look at the spreadsheet and say, oh, okay, I understand that business. And then as you get more and more technical, more and more subsector, if you will, it takes the industry to mature so that an activist can actually look at now a medical device company and analyze that, or even further can analyze a biotech company as well. And so I think the activists are getting more mature. They understand MedTech better. And so when they do that, they can say, hey, you have this division that does cardiovascular and you have this division that does diabetes, and they trade at a multiple that is the diabetes multiple. But really, if you just separated out the cardiovascular business, it would float to a higher multiple. And so the sum of the parts is better. They can do that analysis, I think, much more readily now than, maybe historically the generalist activists could do. And, it's also just part of the way of the world now. I think many public company boards are dealing with that.
Right. And something, I wonder one thing that was sort of a big defining event, I think, for all industries was, of course, COVID, and, how people thought about things differently, the way they adapted their lives, investments and everything. So I want to bring up a chart right here for you to take a look at and just get your reaction to. And for those who are watching on Spotify and YouTube, you can see this. So this is from Thomas Lafont's presentation at the All-In Summit last year, essentially showing the number of exits that, that exits are essentially depressed. So if you look at US VC exit activity, this is across all industries, right? 2020 is about 298 billion. 2021, 711 billion, but then 2022, 23, 24 is 88, 65, 90 billion. So like really, really depressed. And so the sort of takeaway from this was that in the last like 5 or 6 years, like venture has really underperformed. And so I'm wondering, like, when that happens, even if you have a really good performing fund, that's going to affect how LPs deploy money and how things happen. Have you guys, evolved, let's say, your approach and hypotheses with the market and your investment thesis? Like how has COVID and things like this essentially changed your firm, if it has at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things, and I might even take your question a couple ways. So just to answer your question on the investing side, but also talk about it from a healthcare perspective. So from an investing perspective, it is true that when the LPs look at the asset class, the liquidity has been very, very low, right? Very few IPOs. You just showed the exit chart. And so I would say that, part of the ecosystem is they give us money, we invest it, and then we give them money back so that they can invest it again. And if they're not getting distributions back, then their liquidity is actually lower and they can no longer then deploy new capital. So there's no question that venture growth, a lot of the private equity assets have not been able to generate a lot of liquidity, and that has put pressure on a lot of the LPs. In fact, I would say quite publicly, a number of very large plans have had to do secondary sales to generate more liquidity so that they can make the capital calls and diversify their exposure by time in terms of vintages as well. So what does that mean for us? A few things. One, I would say, I don't know if you're familiar with this term DPI, but
definitely
distribution. Not. Okay, so what happens in investing is you have, of course, the capital that you have invested. You have your carrying value. What is that company worth? It goes up and down, maybe with up rounds or down rounds. And then you have something called distributions to paid in capital, which is what the LPs actually care about. And what I mean by that is they can give us $100 and we can say, hey, we invested in this company and it got stepped up and now it's worth $200. That's great, but they still have zero sitting in their bank account because it's all with us in some sort of illiquid security. What they can really count on is distributions to paid in capital. So how much money have they given us and how much money have we given them back? And so in this current environment, I would say LPs are valuing DPI, distributions, much higher than your carrying value. So they're like, that's great. I'm happy that you got that thing stepped up round to round. But what I really care is how much money have you given me back? And the reason that matters is because of the lack of liquidity. So I would say many investors and companies now will say, maybe I will take the return now so I can send money back, as opposed to, oh, well, if I wait 2 years longer, maybe I'll get 5 times my money instead of the 3 times my money now.
And that explains why a lot of VC is trying to play private equity in the sense that like I know a few firms that changed their name to capital because they want to indicate they only invest in revenue generating companies. And so I think, obviously if you invest in a revenue generating company, like the DPI is going to be much higher and more reliable, correct?
Yes, that's right. And the time frames, right? Because, there's a lot of funds that have, especially the early stage funds that, the exit window really shut down. And so now their holding periods have gone from, 5 or 6 years to 8 or 9 years. And, that's a long time.
I wonder, do you think, one of the goals of this show and, like having somebody like you on is, we're trying to make MedTech great again. One is, the smartest people in the world, like, who are in college and everything, they're not all going into MedTech. So how do we raise the profile of the industry to those people, but also to attract new investors and LPs into the space? MedTech always seems to be like a steady Eddie industry. And I feel like there's a way for our industry to get better about, rather than having a 10 or 20 or 30x return, like you see might be in traditional tech, that in MedTech, there's a reliable way to get maybe a 3 or 4x return within like 5 to 6 years. Do you feel like that's a narrative that the industry can put out there?
Yeah, I would say it's probably true that the risk return profile of medtech is different than, say, biotech or consumer internet, for example. So I think that that's definitely the case. The steady Eddie component of it, if you are an allocator across multiple sectors, that's probably a reputation that medtech actually has. I think the part that medtech could change is, in fact, it's sort of the way we look at the world now too. The world in healthcare is not siloed by sectors. People want to say, I invest in medtech or diagnostics or digital health or services or drugs, but no physician actually says, I'm a drug doctor, I'm a device doctor, I'm a diagnostic doctor.
That's a great point.
They say, right? They say, I'm an oncologist or I'm a cardiologist. I see cancer patients, I see heart patients. Sometimes I use a drug, sometimes I use a device, sometimes I use a diagnostic. So in the real world, it all comes together. And so I think medtech needs to continue to realize that. So it's not a device anymore, right? It's a connected device. It's not just imaging, it's AI imaging. It's no longer just an implant, it has a biologic attached to it. And so all of a sudden now medtech is not just physical devices, it has biologic technology, it has AI attached to it, it has other components. And by the way, now you start blending into what are these historical subsectors. So we actually think, for example, at HealthQuest, that it's important to see the entire landscape and not just look at medtech by itself, because medtech will get affected by these other technologies. And in fact, the best innovation is at the intersection of historical silos, so that you take mechanical innovation and combine that with chemistry, or combine that with AI, because that's really the future of healthcare.
When evaluating that within the context of, let's say, first, like there's two forces that are happening, at least that from what we're seeing here, like having different people on the show and where we're looking in the markets, is that one is the consumerization of healthcare. So whether it's COVID itself or it just accelerated trend, there's higher public interest right now. Like I talked to an expert on X threads, we're trying to do more X threads and everything. And his thing was like, the top performing threads is things about wealth, things about health, right?
Yeah.
And so, I'm still today shocked, but like the amount of things people are paying cash for health, including myself, whether it's like continuous glucose monitors, blood work, all these different things, because that's happening. The other side is that you have these multi-trillion-dollar companies like Alphabet, like Amazon, who have a fiduciary responsibility to continue growing. Apple's not going to wake up and Tim Cook's going to say, hey, our next venture is we're going to make furniture. Tim Cook's quote was like, the biggest contribution we're going to make is in healthcare. So with these two things happening, do you feel like it's a really great time to be in medtech, and that those kind of forces are going to make us start considering how to become more consumer friendly companies? How do we do partnerships with these larger tech companies? Do you feel like those forces are starting to happen, and even within your own portfolio companies?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that consumer involvement in healthcare is definitely an important trend across multiple dimensions. So it used to be healthcare was adjudicated by the physician. And so the physician said, this is what I'm going to do, and so forth. In fact, we have this joke because my father's a cardiologist, my wife's a cardiologist. And so when my dad practiced, a patient would come in and he'd say, hey, this is my problem, and what should I do, Dr. Kong? And so he'd say, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. And the patient would say, fine, that's what I'm going to do. Today, the patient comes in to see my wife, and they've already done a big Google search, and they say, hey, this is what I want you to do for me. And in fact, my wife has this coffee mug, it's a joke, which is, please don't confuse your Google search with my MD. But the whole concept is that, consumers are much more active with their healthcare now than before, where they were much more passive. And that has reflected in a number of ways. The customer now is not just, if you're pharma, or, I happen to be on the board of LabCorp, if you're a diagnostic company, the customer used to be the physician. Now the customer is the end user, patient, and the provider as well. And so you have to really think differently about how you go to market, how you're communicating, because those decision makers now have changed. And in fact, the technology has also allowed people to be much more comfortable with it. So you mentioned COVID. I would say that pre-COVID, most Americans had never taken a diagnostic test at home unless it was the pregnancy test. So a lot of people take the home pregnancy test, but outside of that, no home diagnostic testing for the most part. After COVID, everybody's taking a COVID test at home. And now it's like this gateway test where now people are much more comfortable taking other kinds of diagnostic tests at home, whether it's vitamin D or testosterone or whatever, food allergies.
I bought 2 of those tests just this week. Believe it or not.
There you go. Yeah. And so now consumers are much more comfortable doing that. The other thing I would say that COVID did for healthcare is get people comfortable around virtual care, right? Because this technology that we're on right now, it existed before COVID, but the utilization of telemedicine before COVID was less than 1% of all the visits. At the peak of COVID, it was something like 52 or 53%. Like the majority of interactions happened virtually. Now it's back down to say, 11 or 12%, which is, by the way, 10 times more than it was before. And so once people have seen their physicians this way virtually, they're more comfortable doing it next time, even if they don't have to. And so all of a sudden you can have care where the consumer, can schedule it a little more freely. And in fact, asynchronous care where you don't have to be live, you can ask a question, the provider can get back to you an hour later, has now become a thing. And so all of a sudden the consumer is much more active there as well. And then, what we have learned in healthcare is that no matter how amazing your physician is, unless the patient is engaged, it doesn't work. And so actually having the consumer engaged and caring about healthcare, both for themselves, but to be fair, for the expenses of the healthcare system, is actually a positive thing. And so I would tell you, almost every major healthcare entity is thinking about how to go directly to the consumer, the underlying patient. And then you made a really interesting comment, Omar, about the big tech companies like Apple and I used to say Facebook, but Meta and so forth. And it's really logical for them. Because if you think about it, at the scale that those companies are, keep in mind, healthcare is 20% of GDP, right? And it's growing. And if you are going to be a huge company, you almost have to play in healthcare. There's like almost no way you can't play in healthcare. And so what we're seeing, and those companies, by the way, are all expert consumer companies. So when they come to healthcare, they bring this very consumer lens that pulls into the whole system. And all of a sudden, the Apple Watch is now a healthcare device, if you will.
And a great referral device to cardiologists, by the way, because the moment, I've talked to cardiologists and they've all said like the Apple Watch is amazing for referrals because the moment my patient has any little thing come up, they immediately book an appointment and come see me,
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've been involved with some of these electrophysiology companies, patches and monitoring. And as you pointed out, Omar, the Apple Watch drives a lot of referrals, top of the funnel, if you will. The other part that we found interesting is companies that maybe adjacent have started to play. When I think of Best Buy, I think about, well, I'm going to buy my television there or some other electronics. But the way Best Buy has previously thought about it is, hey, I have this geek squad and I'm in your home millions and millions and millions of times a year. while I'm putting in your security system, I should put in your remote monitoring at the same time. And so I would have never thought of Best Buy on the competitor or partner list for our healthcare businesses. But in the last 5 years, you got to think about Best Buy, which is a little atypical as well. And so I would say a lot of adjacent companies and just pure tech companies that have a consumer lens have come into healthcare. So I think we're in a new state. I mean, we're never going back to consumers just giving up control.
And I think we're the future of healthcare is not only scaling the expertise of a specialist through devices. So you have like Echo, the smart stethoscope, so it scales the specialties of a cardiologist. You have DermaSensor, which takes the specialties of a dermatologist and scales it through primary care. I think the other side of it is like, how does healthcare come directly to the consumer? So that includes like blood work. There's so many things that are done in a hospital. I mean, look, I have some friends who are agency owners in Miami who are doing extremely well, and one of them needed an X-ray, and there's a mobile service that has a mobile C-arm that just comes directly to your home. Right. Versus, you know, what do you have to, you have to go to the imaging center, you have to park, you have to wait in line. All this is a huge headache. Right. And so I think this like personalization and customization of healthcare is really exciting. I know we're getting close to time, unless you're having such a great time, you're going to cancel your car, but I know you're very busy. I want to show you one last slide, and I want to kind of get your take on it. So let me pull this up real quick. I just saw this the other day on X, and I went and looked at, I'll actually send you this deck. So if I mispronounce it, sorry guys, it's Kotu. They had a keynote presentation. And so the slide is saying that tech is driven by major waves of innovation. So, you know, from the 60s, you had the mainframe, PC, networking, you get to the 2010, that's mobile internet. And each one of these waves, there are certain companies that benefited. So in the 2010s, you had like Apple or like ByteDance. ByteDance was the owners of TikTok. And each of these waves keeps getting bigger and bigger in terms of like the market and opportunity. Now we're in this AI wave, and you have companies like NVIDIA, Broadcom, Oracle. So like NVIDIA hit $4 trillion a week ago, right? Yeah. And so in this wave, this is going to have such a strong pull that it's going to bring a lot of healthcare with it. In med device, like what comes to mind when you see a graphic like this? I don't want to like give you any examples or anything, but I'm just wondering, when you look at this as an investor, how do you interpret this? How do you think of it?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think AI is going to be a huge factor in, to be fair, all of industries, and certainly in healthcare and in MedTech. When we look at AI, we think of it as a tool. It's no different than saying the internet. And so almost all of our companies are using AI across a few different dimensions. So at a minimum, in terms of operating efficiency, it doesn't matter what kind of business they're in, they're applying AI so that they can be more efficient. You know, to be fair, many of them actually have line items saying, because of AI, I'm going to save X million dollars next year. Either I'm not going to hire more, or I'm going to be more efficient with who I've got. So that's an internal operation approach. From an external perspective, depending on the kind of business, you know, we see companies using AI for patient identification in terms of the right patients for the right procedure, the right intervention. We see AI in terms of patient engagement. So how do you interact and how do you engage patients? I mean, the scary thing is AI is actually better than humans at engaging patients. In fact, if you're on the other end of it, you actually can't tell.
Didn't it show that
you're talking to him.
Didn't they do a study? They showed that the AI actually has better bedside manner.
Yeah, way better bedside manner. They're never in a bad mood. They never forget, and they can actually be tailored. You know, a physician's personality is whatever it is. AI personality can change if the patient's 85-year-old white female or a 23-year-old African-American male. And so turns out that AI is really good at that kind of engagement interaction. So, you know, what I would say is that's just internal operations. That's the delivery of care. And then I think AI will also have opportunities from a better outcomes perspective as well. I mean, the easier lower hanging fruit are on the imaging side, right? AI definitely reads chest x-rays, mammograms, digital pathology slides. You know, they should be able to read them better than anybody. And by the way, this is an interesting point. AI is not just going to be the best physician, like the perfect human physician. It will actually be better. And what I mean by that is, if you just take a radiologist, for example, and say, please look at this chest x-ray, and you just assume the radiologist is a human, never makes a mistake, didn't get tired, the AI can be better because it can physically see things in the pixels that the human eye cannot see. And so now it's no longer teaching the AI to be as good as the best radiologist. It's actually the AI is better than the world's best radiologist. And so we're going to see that trend.
I don't know if I'm going to remember the name of the company. Maybe it's Cure Metrics. There's like a company that essentially is deploying AI in mammography because the mammography is able to pick up women who are at high risk for cardiovascular events, right? And so like something that's mainly used for like breast cancer screening is for other things. I think that's the exciting things that using the applications of AI. And again, there's a lot of companies out there that don't have to build their AI from the ground up, right? But you can use these applications. If you have a new mechanism to capture all this data, you have something that can actually interpret all this data at scale. And not only do we get to, let's say, predictive health, because you can find earlier and earlier signs, but then to say like, hey, if, for example, if I'm going to go in, let's use my friend as an example, and I'm going to have a C-arm, do an X-ray, maybe within my X-ray, there are certain marks in there that can indicate risk for prostate cancer or risk for heart disease or other things. We have no idea. Right, because these images are data rich. It's just we weren't able to interpret them with a human eye. So it's just such an exciting time to be in our space.
Well, the other thing that, not to be overly futurist about this, is that the AI can actually do things where we don't understand the mechanism. So, for example, when we look at, I remember doing this with another company, they have trained the AI to look at a slide, and the slide is cancer or no cancer. Now, normally you think, I'm going to train the AI to look for, the nucleus is larger or the shape is irregular or something. You give them these characteristics to call out what a cancer cell is. When I talked to the person who programmed the algorithm, he said, no, I gave them 10,000 slides of cancer and 10,000 slides of normal. I didn't tell them any rules. And now they can tell the difference, but I actually don't know what they're looking at. And so now the AI has gotten to the point where they are identifying it better than we can give them the rules to identify it, because they see something that's different between cancer and normal that we actually can't describe. And so I do think that from a future point of view, it will actually be beyond the limits of what we know, because they are learning things that we actually don't know. And this is happening today, by the way.
I completely agree with it. And just like to put it in context for the audience, like what that makes me think about is, I think it was in either Go or chess. I think it was chess, actually, that AI was playing chess and it made a move that did not make any sense. But then literally, I think like 30 moves later, it won the game. And so it did something so early on that it just didn't make any sense at all until the very end. And so I think it's the same thing with healthcare. There might be some things that it picks up that doesn't make any sense to us. And then lo and behold, we realize that, I don't know, it predicted cancer like 30 years out, and then rather than, I don't know, maybe then I'm just kind of, going off the top of my head. But if it did something like that, then maybe then let's say a woman having a mastectomy or having a big chunk of her breast removed, maybe it's just a tiny, tiny little like centimeter of a biopsy because it predicted that far ahead, and you have that removed just through like an in-office needle biopsy procedure, and then you're done. You're cancer free, right?
Well, and in fact, I agree with that, but we can take it even farther.
Take it farther, Garheng. That's why the people wanted you on the show, by the way. So take it farther.
Well, so if you think about it, Target knows whether or not you're pregnant without the result of your pregnancy test based on what you're buying in your shopping cart. People know whether or not you have lung cancer based on whether or not you're buying a lot of certain kinds of tissues and wipes and cough drops and so forth. All of a sudden, you're taking what we consider to be historically consumer or non-healthcare data, and you combine it with actual healthcare data, and then the predictive power can actually be really, really significant. And so I don't know if you ever saw this movie Gattaca, like 20 years ago, where
great movie. Yes. That's a throwback.
They took a pinprick of blood in the heel when the baby, and they predict the kid's entire future. I would say that we're not there yet, but the ability to take lots of disparate sources of data, whether it's what you're buying at Target versus your actual clinical labs and whatever pictures you're posting online, that actually composite actually gives the fullest picture of health. And I think that we're going to need to take advantage of all those disparate databases, and AI is going to actually help us do that. So I think the future from a diagnostic perspective is going to be really different than the way we think about it now.
I completely agree. Garheng, I want to be respectful of your time. You got to go. You got your meeting till top of the hour, correct? So the audience has to let you go, right?
I do, but it's been a real pleasure to spend time with you, Omar.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. We definitely have to have you back on. And we have 2 minutes left. So I got one last question for you. Not a tough one, but as an investor, I think continuing education is very, very important. I'm wondering, like, for young aspiring investors, what are a couple of books that you often recommend to help develop like a young aspiring investor? We're thinking about like somebody who's in their 20s is like, yeah, I want to be the next Garheng Kong. What kind of books do you recommend that person read?
To be totally fair, I don't usually recommend books. I would tell you that the most important thing, at least in our business, it's actually an apprenticeship business. And so the question is, can you get somebody to mentor you? And I don't mean in a every day, every week sense, but somebody who will meet with you periodically to help you think about your career and certainly in investing as well, because everybody has a slightly different style, a different approach. And I think you actually learn from other people who you think are successful. And if you have the opportunity to integrate across a few of those folks, that's actually been the most valuable for me, is to, I've had mentors at every stage of my career, whether it's medical school, graduate school, business school, operating, investing. And that's actually been the most effective thing for me. I think it's quite hard to read it out of a book. So I'd encourage everybody out there to seek out mentors.
I completely agree. Was there a book that you feel like you gift most often, whether it comes to like, frameworks or the way you think or anything? We got to give the people something that they got to buy right away, at least, so they can just dive into it. Not everybody can get mentored by you.
Well, I would tell you that one of the things that I found to be important is understanding how to prioritize things. And so an anecdote that I really love is this anecdote that Warren Buffett has about the 2 lists. And so his pilot came to him and said, "Hey, Warren, you're really successful. How have you done that?" And he said, "Well, give me the 25 most important things in your life that you want to prioritize." And so he dutifully goes and does that. He comes back and Warren says, "Well, tell me of the 25, which 5 are the most important?" So he goes back, does those 5, comes back, and Warren Buffett says, the most important thing you can do is not do the other 20 things. Because in life, there's lots of interesting things. The A idea is obvious. The F idea is obvious. The hardest part is when the B idea shows up and you waste time on it. And so I think that one of the things that has been an important framework for me is to recognize the things that could be attractive, but really are not that important, and to not spend time on those and really spend time on the things that matter. So that's been a framework that I've been thinking a lot about, in my career, and it might be worth considering.
That's the pearl that we were looking for. Garheng, thank you so much. We're going to let you go. I know you're late to your appointment or your meeting. I want to thank everybody for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, send it on to an investor. Go follow Garheng and HealthQuest Capital on LinkedIn. Like and comment on their posts. We'll get Garheng back on. And as always, I'm your host, Omar Khatib, and we'll see you all. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.